Hey there, everybody. My name is Talia, and I am a medical technologist. I was once upon a time a student, like many of you, and if you're listening, it's because you probably have questions about the ASCP exam, or you're struggling with a certain topic, or maybe you're just curious. Either way, my goal is to reach and help as many laboratory students as I possibly can to help guide you to pass for your boards. And if any of you have failed the exam, don't worry about it. Dust it off. It's over. It happened. Learn from it. What did you see? And my first recommendation to you is to start from the lowest score. So you have to get a 400 in all these categories. And so wherever you got the lowest score, that's where you want to focus on. If it's laboratory operations, then what you need to do is read, because laboratory operations is reading. The rest of it does involve much more critical thinking, and the exam calls for more of the metabolic physiology of the way it all works systemically within the body. It all connects. They want to know the connection. Do you know the connections? Are you able to decipher if something is wrong, if it's a true negative or a false? And if it is, what can you do to fix it if you can, right? So that is what the test calls for. And I cannot tell you what is on the test, what I saw specifically, but I can guide you, and I can do that with their study guide. So I am going to provide the ASCP study guide, and we're going to break it down. I am going to start in chemistry because it is my favorite subject. So if you like my channel and you like my content and you find it helpful, please like my channel and let me know if you have any questions or comments or concerns, and subscribe if you want to be in the loop of when I'm dropping new content. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and whenever I drop, you'll be the first to know. Until then, keep your head up, keep studying, keep grinding, and God bless. Glycolysis, glycogenesis, glyconeogenesis, glycogenolysis, and lipogenesis are all vocabulary terms that you're not only going to have to memorize for the exam, but you're going to have to understand the mechanism of how they work underneath the hood in the metabolic pathways and glucose metabolism, and how they play a role in hormonal regulation and effects in our blood glucose serum levels. So it's important to understand these terms. I have mentioned them in my slides. These all come from my high yield notes. I have also provided worksheets that you can follow and see the definition of these terms there. So I recommend you to look at the worksheets that I've provided, as they all come from my personal high yield notes. Glucose metabolism. Glucose is our body's main sugar. It's like our gas in our car. It powers everything. Glucose metabolism is how our body processes this sugar to make energy. It could either make the energy, it could store it, or create more when we're running low. And there are a few key pathways I already mentioned that are essential to this. And I'll keep it simple. Glycolysis breaks down glucose into smaller bits to make energy fast. Gluconeogenesis makes new glucose when we're out of it. Glycogenolysis pulls glucose out of storage. Glycogenesis stores extra glucose as glycogen. And in the pentose phosphate pathway, a side path that makes special molecules, including G60PH. And these pathways are important because they keep our blood sugars steady and our cells happy. If something goes wrong, an imbalance, we get issues like diabetes or even hemolytic anemia. And so, glycolysis, it takes one glucose molecule, one little sugar, and it chops it into two smaller pieces inside the cytoplasm of the cells. And it makes pyruvate. So these smaller pieces would be called pyruvate. And it uses it, and it makes this in order to make a bit of energy, ATP. And how it works is that glucose inside the cell gets tweaked to start the process. It gets split into the 2-pyruvate. After it's split into the 2-pyruvate, is used to get 2 ATP and 2 NADH. These would be considered energy carriers per glucose. So 2 ATP, we'll call them coins, energy coins, and 2 NADH, energy carriers per glucose. So to put in a little analogy, would be like breaking a candy bar into bite-sized pieces for a quick snack. It's fast, but it doesn't give us a ton of energy. It's just like real quick. And then we have a very long step process after that. As many of us remember, this process is a 10-step process, and it all occurs in the Krebs cycle inside the mitochondria of the cell. And inside the mitochondria of the cell, this is where it creates all of our ATP. And it can create about 36 to 38 ATP molecules. And so that's one way that glucose is used. It's used to make energy in the body. And then we have the pentose phosphate pathway. This is it's an alternative route, an additional route where if more is needed there, more glucose will go there. So what it is that the pentose phosphate pathway and G6PD-H, it takes the glucose 6-phosphate from glycolysis and it uses it to make two things. It makes NADPH, which is a molecule that protects cells from damage. It protects it from oxidative stress and free radicals. And it also makes ribose 5-phosphate, and it's used to build DNA and RNA. And this happens in the cytoplasm, especially in red blood cells, liver, and our fat tissues. And how it works is it's a two-step process. The first process is an oxidative phase, and the second step is a non-oxidative phase. So for the oxidative phase, the glucose 6-phosphate is turned into 6-phosphogluconolactone by the enzyme G6PD-H. This transformation makes NADPH the shield to our red blood cells, if you will. And in the step 2 non-oxidative phase, it rearranges sugars to make ribose or feed back to glycolysis. So it's like a side hustle. The glucose takes a detour from glycolysis to make protective shields, NADPH, or building blocks for ribose. And so G6PD-H is the star enzyme, it's a critical enzyme in the pentose phosphate pathway. And this NADPH is essential when it's made from this enzyme because it keeps glutathione, the protector, active, like present, and it shields our red blood cells from oxidative stress, damage from chemicals or infections or drugs. These would be considered triggers, and it causes a deficiency. So it's basically just protecting the cell from that. And the deficiency can either be caused by a trigger or it can be caused by a genetic condition where the G6PD-H doesn't work well. Again, X-linked. It's an X-linked genetic disorder in the X chromosome. And it's common in African, Mediterranean, and Asian populations. And that low NADPH makes weak glutathione. That weak glutathione means that red blood cells can't fight oxidative stress and they burst. This causes hemolysis. This would cause an intravascular hemolysis because it's happening within the cell. And it can cause symptoms such as hemolytic anemia, tiredness, jaundice, dark urine, and even severe neonatal jaundice in babies. And I would like to point that G6PD-H-A is a genetic variant. It's a mild deficiency and it is frequent in between 10 to 25% in sub-Saharan African because it protects against malaria. It's very cool. It protects against malaria, but it also can cause a deficiency. So it's like, where do you? It's interesting is what it is. And so this is important to us medical technologists because we run different types of tests in the lab in order to come up with a proper diagnosis for the physician and the nurses. And so we got to do a lot of patient history. Patient history is everything. So we're looking at patient history, and in the laboratory, we also are testing for the glucose metabolism. We're running blood glucose, hemoglobin A1C. We're checking lactate tests to check for diabetes or glycolysis issues or metabolic disorders. If And then, we would also do enzyme assays for the G6PD-H deficiency, and this would be more obviously in the chemistry side, and this would be like a fluorescent spot test. We would mix blood with chemical, and they would check for the glow under the UV light. If there is a glow under the light, then that means that it's all good. If there's no glow for the NADPH, then that would cause a deficiency. And there is, the issue of hemolysis that it can give us a false normal. So because some young red blood cells have more G6PD-H. If that happens, we would just have to retest later. And in addition to that, we would also, in hematology, do peripheral blood smears. We would also do CBCs, and we would look for reticulocyte count. We would also look for bilirubin and LDH. And these are essential because, number one, we would be looking for red blood cell inclusions. These are known as bite cells. They look chewed, literally like you took a bite in the red blood cell. And then the next ones that we would also be looking for would be Heinz bodies. These would be damaged hemoglobins. And if there's a high reticulocyte count, it is basically telling us that the body is trying to replace the burst red blood cells. And of course, bilirubin and LDH, if there's high levels, that would confirm the red blood cell breakdown. And so for the exam, it's going to test the glucose metabolism and G6PD-H in hematology. For hemolysis, the peripheral blood smears, and in clinical chemistry, they would probably most likely look for the enzyme assays and bilirubin. So you need to know G6PD-H deficiency, what populations it affects, the high prevalence, and how to interpret any tricky results like false negatives and what would cause that. G6PD-H deficiency. This occurs in the pentose phosphate pathway. This is the pathway, to simply reiterate it, is where glucose 6-phosphate form from glycolysis, and it uses it to make two things. So it takes that glucose 6-phosphate and it makes NADPH, the shield to our red blood cells. It's a molecule that protects our cells from damage, and that's why I think of it as a shield, because it's protecting our red blood cells from any type of oxidative stress. And in addition to making NADPH, it also makes ribose 5-phosphate, and this is used to build DNA and RNA. This happens in the cytoplasm, especially in red blood cells, liver, and fat tissue. And there are two steps that this happens, as we've already discussed in the previous slide with the pentose phosphate pathway. But so that you can further understand, the first step is that glucose 6-phosphate is turned into 6-phosphogluconolactone by the enzyme G6PD-H. By that conversion, it makes NADPH. Step 2 is the non-oxidative phase. So the first is an oxidative phase and the second is a non-oxidative phase. In the non-oxidative phase, it rearranges sugars to make ribose or feed back to glycolysis. So basically, glucose takes a detour from glycolysis to make protective shields, NADPH, or building blocks, ribose. So G6PD-H is the star enzyme of the pentose phosphate pathway. It's the star enzyme of the first step. So why it matters is because NADPH keeps glutathione, a protector, if you will, active, and it shields our red blood cells from oxidative stress, damage from chemicals, or infections. So If there is not enough produced, let's say a genetic condition where G6PD-H doesn't work well, for example, X-linked genetic condition, this is common in African, Mediterranean, and Asian populations. And what happens is that there is low NADPH, which makes weak glutathione, and the red blood cells can't fight oxidative stress, so they burst, and this creates a hemolysis. This is considered an intravascular hemolysis because it's bleeding within the body, within the cell. And there are triggers that can cause this to happen, a deficiency. And these triggers include drugs like primaquine for infections as malaria, or fava beans. And if there is a hemolysis and the red blood cells do burst, a patient will experience symptoms. Those symptoms could be hemolytic anemia, which could cause tiredness, jaundice, or dark urine. And also, it can also be severe for neonatal jaundice in babies. And the reason why this is common in African kids is because the G6PD A variant is a mild deficiency is frequent in between 10 to 25% in sub-Saharan Africa because it protects against malaria. So this is important for us to know as medical laboratory scientists because we're detectives in the lab. We're running tests to spot problems in glucose metabolism or G6PD-H deficiency. This is huge for our ASCP exam and is real world work. And the reason why is because of the testing that we do. We do testing glucose metabolism. We run tests for blood glucose, hemoglobin A1C, lactate test to check for diabetes, any type of glycolysis issues, or metabolic disorders. And, high glucose might mean that glycolysis isn't working right, so we have to report it to help diagnose diabetes. We also test for G6PD-H deficiency in chemistry and hematology. In enzyme assays, we do fluorescent spot tests. We mix blood with chemicals and we check for NADPH glow under UV light. If there's no glow, there's a deficiency. And this is common in African screening programs. Then there's quantitative assays. We measure the activity with a spectrophotometer. If less than 60%, this equals a deficiency. But there's also a gotcha because hemolysis, if there's red blood cells bleeding or bursting, then it can give us a false normal. This is when young red blood cells have more G6PD-H. So if this happens, this gives us a troubleshooting issue. We'll have to retest the patient later. And in hematology tests, we run CBCs, complete blood cell counts, and this checks for low hemoglobin for anemia during that hemolysis. We also look under blood smears and we look for bite cells, and they look like they're chewed, like literally like you chewed off of a donut, or Heinz bodies, and these are damaged hemoglobins. We also do a reticulocyte count, and if a high count appears, then it shows that the body is trying to replace those burst red blood cells. In addition to that, we also run tests for bilirubin and LDH. This high level, if there is a high level of bilirubin and LDH, this would confirm that there is hemolysis and indeed a red blood cell breakdown. So again, this is important for us to know, and I hope that this explanation helped further understand your understanding of this topic. Imagine our body as a busy city, and let's call this city Glucose City. All right, Glucose City, it's like a metropolis where glucose is the energy currency needed to power our homes, ourselves. And the city has a warehouse, glycogen, and here it stores glucose packets. And it also has a factory, liver and the kidneys. Here we make new glucose, and we also have delivery gates, the GLUT4 transporters. These guys let glucose into homes, our muscle and fat cells. And insulin is the city mayor who manages glucose distribution, while insulin antagonists are rival officials who disrupt insulin's plans by flooding the city with glucose or locking the gates. So, how does this happen? Well, insulin is our mayor, and since he's responsible for distribution of glucose, he unlocks the delivery gates, GLUT4, with a special key. and it distributes glucose to homes, our muscle and fat cells. And so insulin, our mayor, says store all the glucose, no more sugar production. And the metabolic side of insulin is that it inhibits glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. And then we have glucagon. Glucagon is our warehouse raider. He is an insulin antagonist, and he is a rival official who sneaks into the warehouse to grab glucose packets or fires up the factory to produce new glucose, ignoring the mayor's insulin orders. So in science terms, it lowers glucose during fasting when the glucogen raids the warehouse, and then glycogenolysis starts the factory to make new glucose by gluconeogenesis. So during fasting, during a low glucose time when we're not really eating, there's low glucose in our body, low sugar, glucogen raids the warehouse. And it does this with the help of glycogenolysis. And between them, they start the factory and they make new glucose with the help of gluconeogenesis. And then we have ACTH. This is our factory foreman. And he indirectly is an insulin antagonist. This guy is the one who calls cortisol to start the factory production during a city emergency, a stress event. And he does this. He raises glucose in our bloodstream by promoting gluconeogenesis with the help of cortisol. Then we have our growth hormone. He is like a resource scavenger. He's also an insulin antagonist, and this is like a rogue worker who collects city resources such as meat and oil to make glucose in the factory. And he sometimes locks some delivery gates like Glut4 to keep glucose in the streets. And so he raises the bloodstream to go up, the glucose bloodstream to go up. And then we have HPL. This guy is our baby protector. His whole job, he don't care about nothing else. His whole job is during pregnancy. And his job is to make sure that baby is getting enough sugar. So inadvertently, he raises blood glucose in the bloodstream, because he's literally bringing all the sugar over here. Like, no, baby needs some, bring it over here. And so he's a guardian who produces glucose for the baby's nursery, right? And so he locks the delivery gates, Glut4, to save the glucose for the baby. Absolutely defying insulin. And insulin is just like, what am I supposed to do? He's probably the only one that can really get away with it, right? And then epinephrine. This guy, he is our emergency responder. He is our insulin antagonist. And during stress, this guy rapidly raids the warehouse with the help of glycogenolysis and starts the factory production through gluconeogenesis. And so this guy, he's our firefighter. He grabs the warehouse glucose packets and rushes to the factory to make new glucose during a city crisis, ignoring insulin's rules. He's got to do what he's got to do. He's got to save the people. So more power to you, right? And T3, T4, he's an indirect insulin antagonist. This guy is a city energizer. He boosts the city's metabolism, their vibe, right? And these guys are engineers who crank up the city's power grid, speeding up factory work through the help of gluconeogenesis, and sometimes clashes with insulin's plans. And then we have our cortisol, our stress producer. He is also an insulin antagonist.
And he makes new glucose through gluconeogenesis using amino acids and glycerol during stress. And, these guys being insulin antagonists can cause insulin resistance. And these insulin antagonists, whether they inadvertently or they just, they have to do it. What it is that it increases that blood glucose into our bloodstream. And so everyone here raises blood sugar while insulin, the mayor, is trying to decrease sugar.
Once upon a time, in a kingdom full of sweets, lived the Sugar Princess. She was a kind woman loved by all her townsfolk, and just as kind as she was, they would bring her cakes, candies, and treats, all types of pastries that she could ever imagine, all freshly baked from scratch by all of her beloved townsfolk. But what the townsfolk didn't know about the Sugar Princess was that she was starting to feel some kind of way. She noticed that she started to get thirsty a lot, like more than usual, just, more thirsty. And then she thought, well, I am drinking more water. It makes sense that I would be having to use the bathroom more. So she starts using the bathroom more. And then she says, well, one of my gowns just isn't tight enough anymore. It's just not hugging my hips right. And so she notices that she's starting to lose a little bit of weight. And so she goes to the king and queen and tells them what's going on about her beautiful gown, the thirstiness, the bathroom. And so immediately they call the town's doctor. Doctor comes in, welcomed by the people, very kind kingdom. And he says, uh-oh, this sounds to me like maybe the Sugar Princess might have a pre-diabetic situation going on. But to be sure, let me call one of my boys. And he calls the wizard. The wizard comes and he brings his apprentice. His apprentice brings his tools with him. And they say, look, here's what we're going to do. If it's all right with you, we're just going to hang out for 8 to 12 hours while the princess fasts. She can't eat or drink anything in this time. In the morning, we'll come and draw her blood. This is called a fasting plasma glucose. And then they told her, if the result comes back between 100 and 125 milligrams per deciliter, that means that you don't have diabetes. However, if it comes higher than that, that's another discussion. So morning comes, princess is nervous, you know, don't know what's happening, never done this before. So the apprentice comes in to take the princess's blood. And he comes in with a great top tube. This great top tube is also known as a sodium fluoride potassium oxalate tube. This tube is a great tube to stop glycolysis. And so you would collect it in this tube in 2 to 4 mLs after the fast. He would then centrifuge it within 1 hour, one of his magical little tools that he has. And after that, he could refrigerate it and it would be stable for up to 24 hours. So again, if it's between 100 and 125, she's pre-diabetic. And as it turns out, to her very luck, she is just a pre-diabetic sugar princess. But she needs to take it easy on the sweets. So maybe they can make her like a pot roast or something. On the other hand, if she would have had a result of greater than 126 milligrams per deciliter, that would make her fall into the diabetic range. And she would need to have to confirm it with either a repeat fasting plasma glucose or hemoglobin A1C on a different day. And that measures her glucose, how she monitors or how she's controlling the glucose within a 2 to 3 month span. It's average glucose in that 2 to 3 month span. So if that comes back up high, then obviously, she's diabetic. There's also another way that we could do it if we want to confirm that 126, which is borderline. Well, no, it is diabetic. But anyways, so the patient after that, we would give her the oral glucose tolerance test. All right. And this test, we would give her a drink because she's an adult. It would be 75 grams of glucose dissolved in 300 mLs of water. And she would have to drink this in within 5 minutes. And her blood would be drawn at every the 2 hour it's 2 hour test, so it would be at hour one blood draw, hour two second blood draw. And if the result of that is greater than 200 milligrams per deciliter, that would definitely confirm her diabetes, unfortunately. But she is lucky she does not have diabetes. And the hemoglobin A1C, we were to test that. That is our glycated protein. And by glycated, that means the glucose bound to hemoglobin's beta chain. And if the result of that is greater or equal to 6.5%, that would also confirm diabetes. And that would be collected in a purple top tube with EDTA. This is an anticoagulant, and no, fasting is not required for this test. So these are the tests that the doctor would suggest the wizard perform. And luckily, she's good though. And in the testing, if there's any type of troubleshooting, like hemolysis, for example, that would lower glucose and it would require the apprentice to have to do a redraw, unfortunately, re-poking the sugar princess, which is not always a comfortable thing for the patients. So we want to try to avoid hemolysis, and we want to be aware if lipemia may be present. This is fat in the tube itself, and it would affect the assay. Fat, like as in triglycerides, if the triglycerides are high, chylomicrons, etc. And if if the patient is taking any type of medications like steroids that could raise glucose. So we want to be aware of our patient's history. Luckily, our sugar princess doesn't have any history of this problem. She is just indulging herself way too much, and it's time for her to pull back a little bit and eat something else. So moving forward. All right. So to reiterate what we were just talking about with the sugar princess. So the first thing that we did was we suspected diabetes. The doctor was called. He called the wizard. The wizard brought his apprentice. We drew some blood and we did the fasting plasma glucose first. We made sure that the princess fasted. She did. She did not fall over greater or equal to 126 milligrams per deciliter, which made her only pre-diabetic. So, in the what if scenario, she would have been greater, then we would have either repeated that test or we would have checked the hemoglobin A1C, which and then we would have then we could have also do a the oral glucose tolerance test. We could have given her the glucose drink to see how well she can tolerate glucose, and since she's an adult, we would give her 75 grams worth of glucose, and it would be dissolved in 300 mLs of water, and she would have to drink it within 5 minutes after. And then after that, we would collect the sample, and we would collect that in a gray top sodium fluoride potassium oxalate tube. And the reason why we would want to collect it in that tube and also collect our fasting plasma glucose in that tube is because that tube is designed specifically to stop glycolysis, and the potassium oxalate prevents clotting. And so it's important to collect it in the correct tube and to handle it correctly. Centrifuge it within 1 hour. If it's going to be refrigerated, it needs to be between 2 to 8 degrees Celsius, and it could be stable for 24 hours. And in the event that the gray top is not available, the lithium heparin, the green top, or the cerium bread top can also be used, but it would need to be processed immediately because it does not have that additive to prevent the glycolysis. So that would be a pre-screening. The fasting plasma glucose is the pre-screening. So other than the OGTT, the oral glucose tolerance test, we can also do the 2-hour postprandial plasma glucose test. This is a 2 hour post meal, after a meal. So after the patient, our sugar princess, if in the what if she were to fall in that, we could do that test and we would draw her blood 2 hours after she has a meal. And no glucose drink would be given for this test because we would use the standardized meal and equate it to an equivalent to 75 grams worth of carbohydrates instead of the glucose drink. And the purpose of this is to diagnose the diabetes. Now, if in this test the result is greater or equal to 200 milligrams per deciliter, then that would confirm the diabetes. And that test would also be collected in a gray top sodium fluoride potassium oxalate tube. For gestational diabetes, this is a test that screens for gestational diabetes, which means diabetes in the pregnancy. And this is a screening test that is done between 24 and 28 weeks. And there's a few ways to go about this. So, first, we would give our patient a 50 grams glucose drink, and it would be dissolved in 200 mLs of water. And so she would drink it within 5 minutes. And then after 1 hour, we would draw her blood. And it's essential to do it 1 hour. It's very important. And if that test, which is also collected in a gray top sodium fluoride potassium oxalate tube, if that test comes back greater or equal to 130 and 140 milligrams per deciliter, depending on what lab or facility you're in. Every place might have their own standard range, but that's just a range to give you an idea where would that fall. If that were to come within that range, that would indicate a possible positive. So then we would follow up with a 100 grams of an oral glucose tolerance test. This would be considered a two-step approach. This test, which is also collected in a gray top tube, which is what kind of tube again? This tube is collected every 2 hours or 3 hours. So instead of the 2 hours, we're going to do 3 hours for the gestational diabetes. So every hour on the hour for 3 hours, we're going to draw her blood. And once that's up, we draw her blood, we get all her blood. We test it, and if the result comes back with that 100 glucose drink that she just drank in 400 mLs of water, if that result comes back greater than 140 mLs per deciliter, then that would indicate that the initial 1 hour screen was positive. And that would be indicative of diabetes. However, if it does not come back between that range of it being greater than 140, then that would mean that the first result was not correct. She does not have gestational diabetes. She's okay. And that's important because gestational diabetes can cause problems to the baby, and we don't want that. And it also can cause problems to mom. And we want to keep them both safe. So it's important to stay on top of prenatal care to get the proper care that you need. All right, so our sugar princess. If her result would have fallen between 74 and 99 milligrams, that would put her in the normal range. She would not be pre diabetic. But because she fell between 100 and 125, that would make her pre diabetic. And if we had done an impaired glucose tolerance test on her, that for a 2 hour test, and it was greater than 140, then she would be a diabetic. And again, if we did the 2 or more fasting plasma glucoses and the result remained greater than 126, then definitely she would be diabetic. And for gestational diabetes, she would obviously, she's our sugar princess is not pregnant, but for a pregnant patient, she would have to fall between 140 greater or equal to 140 to be considered with gestational diabetes. If she falls below 140 in the 1 hour step, then she's fine. But if she's like 138, 130, if there's a high one, they might want to just double check it and do the step anyways. But if it's definitely over 140, even if it's 143, they're going to want to double check that value, as they should. And so these are my reference ranges. And I also included hemoglobin A1C, which I will be discussing in a different slide. But these are the reference ranges for hemoglobin A1C. This is also another test that we do in the laboratory to monitor glucose management over a span of 2 to 3 months. And hemoglobin A1C is a glycated protein. The sticky sugar story, hemoglobin A1C adventure. So as you can see here, this is a red blood cell. He's running away. He doesn't want to ride on the red blood cell bus because the red blood cell bus is going to the spleen station. And on this bus, on this ride, he carries hemoglobin, our oxygen carrying protein. And in addition to also carrying hemoglobin, it also carries glucose, these delicious sugar cubes and cookies riding on the seats. That would be our glucose. So we got hemoglobin and some glucose. And what happens is that this is a very long ride, and so they start to kind of lean on the wall, put their elbow on the armrest, and at first it's just like a light tap. This is known as a shift base, and it's just a temporary type of tap. Maybe I'll take my arm off of it in a minute here. However, if the sugar is too much, if it's too high, if there's too much sugar on the bus, too much glucose on the bus, what happens is that now they can't get their elbows off the bus because it starts to get hot. Everybody starts to melt, and it gets very sticky very quickly. So now what happens is that they can't get off the seat. They're officially bound to the seat. And this very stickiness that comes from themselves, let's just call it a glue, a super glue, if you will. This is known as a covalent bond. And this covalent bond from chemistry eons ago is how atoms share electrons. They keep them nice and tight. And this glue forms the hemoglobin A1C, and it locks in for the ride. And it does this because when it puts his arm on the elbow rest, it slides up to the hemoglobin's N terminal valine. And that little quick just elbow tap, that shift base, that quick tap, that temporary bond, maybe I'll take my elbow off in a minute. It's not always just a minute. As I said, that forms that glue and that forms that hemoglobin A1C. And the more stickier it gets. Is no one sticking after that. Everybody is down for the ride. Nobody's getting off. So that covalent bond is known as a ketamine bond. It's that super glue. Okay? And so that elbow tap is then glued to that seat with that hemoglobin A1C label because they can't get off the seat now. Glucose stuck to the seat. And so they get on the seat, they get on the bus, they're stuck on the bus, and then now they're headed to the spleen station. 120 days later, the hemoglobin A1C bond is permanent. That super glue, that covalent bond, stuck tight for the whole red blood cell's life, which is 120 days. Nobody was going to peel it off. So when the red blood cells are done living, the red blood cell bus drives to the spleen station. This is where we are now. And that bus gets recycled, and that all that hemoglobin A1C is gone. New buses, fresh start. And that's why hemoglobin A1C is our go-to for tracking blood sugar for over 2 to 3 months, unlike those one-day glucose checks. And it's important to know the high blood sugar and low blood sugar hypoglycemia, because it's like a candy store explosion. It just explodes. The more sugar, more sticks, more glucose sticks. It starts pushing up hemoglobin A1C more and more through the roof. And a very big thing that I would like to bring up is, if, for example, if a patient were to have a G6PD-H deficiency, this would make that result somewhat inaccurate, because this deficiency causes the red blood cells to die early. So they don't reach the spleen station. They don't reach the spleen station. What happens is that this the candy doesn't stick around long enough to be able to grab the accurate results. So the hemoglobin A1C drops maybe to 4.5%, even if the sugar is high. And so that's why it's important. Patient history, you have to be on top of that. That is huge. And this is the story of the hemoglobin A1C.
So I like to think of it as a report card. So, how hemoglobin A1C changes. Sticky sugar report card. Okay. What happens with high blood sugar or short red blood cell lifespan? Here I've made a graph of hemoglobin A1C, a normal, high blood sugar, and a short red blood cell lifespan. So let's answer that question. First, high blood sugar, like in diabetes, if our blood is like a candy store overflowing with glucose, tons of candies, they're sticking to the hemoglobin. Okay, like we said, glucose sticking to the seats, it's not coming off. So it starts to accumulate. This pushes hemoglobin A1C up, let's say to 8% or more. Basically shouting to the doctors, diabetes, diabetes, yo, diabetes. So now, what if our red blood cells don't live long enough? Okay, this would be a great example going back to G6PDH deficiency. If the red blood cells break down early, let's say half time 60 days instead of 120, they don't have time to collect many glucose candies. So the hemoglobin A1C might look low, like say 4.5%, which is just right below the normal at 5%, even if the blood sugar is high. So it could be tricky. That's why we need to know patient history. And this can fool doctors into thinking that sugar levels are okay when they're not. And so that's why it's important, again, history, history, history. So you guys, we are detectives. We are laboratory detectives. And no matter what area we are analyzing and whatever type of chemistry, we are detectives because we need to be able to decipher if what we're seeing on the screen is a true result. I'm sure you've all heard of the delta. Yes. Well, if we get a delta flag, then that means we either there something is not right, and we need to go back and look at the previous results and see if it matches. Did something go wrong with the specimen, or is that a true result? Something's going on seriously with the patient. We need to be able to connect those dots. So patient history is everything. That's literally like our blind spot. We got to know it. So accurate patient history, number one. Number two, understanding the mechanisms behind what's going underneath the hood. Because you ask yourself, okay, if the sugar princess had a high impaired result, if she would have fallen into the diabetic range because I gave her a glucose drink, right? And to confirm it or to repeat, just to really confirm if she's diabetic, I went ahead and we did a hemoglobin A1C test. But the hemoglobin A1C test is not coming up accurate because it tests of a span between 2 to 3 months. That's 120 days that it takes the red blood cell bus to get to the spleen station. So in the time that the red blood cell bus is driving and it's got its passengers, hemoglobin and glucose, if those passengers, if the hemoglobin in red blood cells starts to decrease, if for some reason they are able to get off of the bus, which would be impossible in a normal adult that does not have diabetes or any other problem. Once the glucose is on the bus and on the seats, and it creates that strong covalent bond after that shift base, they're not getting off. So not the only, but a reason why a red blood cell would not make it to the bus station is because it's possible that that patient has an underlying problem like G6PD deficiency, where the patient is experiencing the red blood cells to not make it to the spleen station. They're dying off too early. They're not making it 120 days. So it makes those results inaccurate. And you could even say hemolytic anemia does that too because you're lysing red blood cells. Anything that would lyse a red blood cell and not make it the full lifespan would alter our results. And so it's important to know our patient history and use our critical thinking skills and be able to look back at previous results with present day results and be like, okay, this makes sense. That's a true result.
Specimen handling and collection. This is most likely the most critical part of working in the laboratory because before these specimens reach our hands, it has to travel through at least 5 or even more people's hands before it actually gets to us. So, you know, we're depending on other people to make sure that
the patient's prepping correctly, that they were informed on how to prepare, if they need to prepare. We are depending that the phlebotomists and the nurses are collecting on the correct patient with the correct tube, and the correct label is being placed on the tube. We're depending on them to make sure that the specimen is delivered to us on time to avoid any type of troubleshooting errors, such as hemolysis, for example. And so it goes through several hands before it gets to us. So once it finally gets to us, that we can test the specimen and we're looking at the specimen, we got it, okay? Now it's our job to make sure that the values that we get from testing said specimen is correct and accurate. Well, how do we do that? We do that by, number one, understanding the mechanism of how the body works, down to the cell itself, how the cell works and what it does in order to survive, and the function of it, the metabolic pathways that it goes through, what could cause any type of discrepancy if there is any. If that's not an issue, that the metabolic pathways are working effectively, everything is good, there are no deficiencies within the patient that would obscure a result, the next thing that we would have to do would be, okay, well, let's look at the specimen. And we probably look at the specimen first, but I guess you can go hand in hand with history, patient history, and tube collection. So I would look at the tube first and then look at the patient history. If the tube is presenting itself in not the correct tube, or not enough was collected, or it was delayed in getting here, or what have you. So if it's not in the correct tube, that's already a problem. The patient unfortunately has to get poked again. They're not going to be happy about that. And if it wasn't inverted, when it's how many times it's supposed to be inverted, why would a purple top need to be inverted 8 to 10 times? The reason why is because the anticoagulant needs to mix, so that to prevent glycolysis. So again, then we would have to figure out, okay, there's more discrepancies. The tube is fine. It was the correct patient. They did a 2-patient identifier, our red rule. Everything is fine. Okay, but there's still a discrepancy. What could be causing this issue? It doesn't make sense. Did the patient vomit the 100 grams glucose? No? Okay, well, what happens if the patient did? Well, we would have to unfortunately dismiss that test and retest for a different day. And if there's a critical value for fasting plasma glucose, what does this mean for the patient? What would be our next step? And or what would invalidate the fasting plasma glucose? For example, what would invalidate something like that? Perhaps the patient vomited, or perhaps the patient didn't fast. There can be many possibilities, but if all of that is fine, none of that, and it's all checks out, then there's something deeper. Well, again, we have to put our detective hat on and we have to look deeper. Okay, maybe now it's the time to look at our quality control. Perhaps we need to recalibrate. Now we need to look at our reagents, what's going on. We need to continue to look down under the hood. So we're detectives. We're following all of the evidence presented to us to be able to come to a true and accurate diagnosis to provide to our physicians and our nurses. And that's our job as medical laboratory scientists. So it's important that we understand the specimen handling and collection, because it is a huge portion of our exam. These are my references. These are what I used to study for my exam. I used my high yield notes, which I'm giving it to you in the slides. I'm taking literally my notes, my words from my notes, and I'm giving it to you guys. And I'm also adding worksheets that you can print or follow along and use them to study. My reference ranges, mind you, are my laboratory reference ranges, though most laboratories do stay within
within a range of equilibrium, if you will. So it's not too far off from maybe perhaps your laboratory. So, but in any case, if you have any doubts, just search up reference ranges. That's what I was told when I was in my program. I didn't like that answer. Go Google it. No, be careful what you Google and where you're searching it. Remember that there are reputable sources and non reputable sources. So you really want to be searching for true values that are close to it, because for the exam, you're going to want to know your reference ranges. Unfortunately, you're going to have to memorize reference ranges, because there might be questions where you're asked and you might not be given a reference range. And that's difficult because, okay, you're being given this question, but if you don't know that reference range, or you're not able to eliminate these options that are provided to you. So reference ranges are important. Memorize those. And if I ever use any other kind of content, any type of books or sources, I will definitely reference them so that you know what I used. And I'm going to let you know what are the books that I use. That way, if you are more of a reader, if you like to answer more questions, because there are books that are just a bunch of questions and you just answer them, which is good. And it's helpful because it's repetitive, and it's repetition is what, gets into our brain long term. However, if you don't know the back detail of those questions being asked, it'll be difficult for you to eliminate those options A through D. So that's why it's important to understand all of this in depth and under the hood, because you really don't know what is going to be asked of you. So these notes that I'm providing you, these slides, all are coming from my high yield notes, which again I've provided in a few worksheets that you can follow. Just find them in the link below, and you'll be able to access them. All right, guys, we've reached the end of our carbohydrates exam review for general chemistry and ASCP. This is our first section completed. Next is lipids. And so this part of the exam makes up 17 to 22% of the total exam. It's a total of 100 questions. So what that means is that you're either going to see between 17 and 22 questions in this topic area. And so to understand the study guide that I provided in the link below, the first is the biochemical theory and physiology. And what this means is it's the science behind how carbohydrates function in our body. The carbohydrates that we eat are broken down into glucose, which gives us energy. And so the basic rule of how the carbohydrates are processed and turning sugar into energy by way of those chemical reactions. The physiology of it is how this happens in our living bodies, mostly in our liver and our muscles. So think of it like the instruction manual for how our body uses bread or pasta for fuel. And these key topics include how the carbs that we ingest are digested and used. And further in the study guide, metabolic pathways, the step by step process, like glycolysis, which I explained in the previous slide, that turns the carbs that we eat into energy, and it either stores them or and it stores them either stores them as sugar, or it stores them as fat. So, and then for the normal and abnormal states, for health, what a healthy carbohydrate level looks like, you need to know what a normal blood sugar versus what a abnormal value would be, and what type of problems come with those excuse me, specific values that, for example, could be causing by diabetes or having hyperglycemia, which is high sugar. So, and then for physical and chemical properties, this is how the carbohydrates behave, how the sugars dissolve in water, or how heat turns starch like gooey, like cooking rice, right? So, it wants to know how those chemical and physical properties of how it works. So, not only do they want to know how it works, but they want to know the actual properties of what's making it do what it needs to do, right? So, how it behaves. And for test procedures, what this means is it's about the laboratory tests that we have to do in the laboratory to measure carbohydrates in the body, in our body fluids, like blood or urine. And the principles of that is the basic idea is using chemicals to detect glucose and understanding special precautions, specimen collection, and processing, the steps that we need to do in order to avoid mistakes, making sure that the patient has accurate and good information to prep, good prep information that they've been talked to about how to prepare for these types of tests to ensure that the values that we're getting are as accurate as possible. Also, on the end of the collectors, the phlebotomists, and our nurses, for them to also know what's the correct tube to use, or also avoiding any type of contamination. Also, us having to understand any troubleshooting issues like hemolysis, which is broken red blood cells that can mess up our results. So, like I said before, you guys are sugar detectives, but you're detectives in general because that's literally your guys' job. One day, you guys are going to be in the laboratory and you're going to be detectives and you're going to have patient history, you're going to have laboratory results, and you're going to have all of this presented in front of you. And even though you don't have direct patient contact, you are diagnosing in the laboratory. That is your job. And so you're basically a detective and you have to follow all these little clues to make sure that all of your evidence is true evidence. And when we have all of our evidence, it's time to run our tests, it's time to run our theories, right? So what it means is that these different tests, we check the different ways that carbs are in our body. So for example, how our body tolerates glucose. So we do tolerance testing. This test, again, we drink our sugar water and we see how our body handles it. This we usually do for our diabetes screening. Then we do glycated proteins like hemoglobin A1C, and it measures how much of that sticky sugar is on our red blood cells over time between a 2 to 3 month span. So again, these are like our fitness trackers for sugar, and it shows how well our body manages carbohydrates long term. And then for test result interpretation and disease correlation, what this means is that we have to understand what the test numbers mean and link them to that health. So again, we have all of our evidence, our history. Okay, now we it's time to interpret. We did our test. Now it's time to interpret. So we have to decide, okay, we have a glucose level of 200. Is this normal or is this a red flag? What does this mean? What is the disease state correlation? So that is connecting the high carbohydrate levels to diseases like diabetes or low levels to starvation. And so for you guys, for my students, it's like reading a report card for your body sugar levels. The high scores mean the opposite, trouble, right? So we're always trying to get those high scores, right? Because we're overachievers, as science nerds. We always want those high scores, but in this testing, we don't want high scores. We want a lower score, you know. And so that's why I think of it as a report card. So I would compare our blood sugar to like a car's fuel, too high or too low. So the engine struggles. We want equilibrium, right? So this is the study guide. This is what we've been studying for. So, like I said, this is the carbohydrate section of the study guide. I hope that I was able to break it down in a way that you were able to understand it. If you did not, that's okay. I welcome constructive criticism. If there's another way that you guys learn, please let me know. I'm open to that. Also, I love science. I just want to help you guys. So, if you like my channel, if you found this at all helpful, give your girl a like. My name is Talia, and subscribe. That way, when I drop lipids next week, you'll know and you'll be able to continue studying. In that time, take care and God bless.